Well, hello, and good morning. So, just so you know, comments I believe are turned on for this. So, now, if you want to interrupt my spiel and thought process, you're free to do so, both on YouTube and Facebook. That should be available. Anyway, today I'm going to be talking just a little bit about depression and ants. Ants is a term I picked up from Jim Quick. I know that I mention his name a lot, but he's got a lot of good videos out there. A.N.T.s means automatic negative thoughts, and it's this is actually what I want to start with. I'm going to start with that. So, this I do not consider to be depression, but we all have that negative voice inside of our head that tells us to regress to mediocrity or that we are mediocre. I'll give you an example. I'm not ashamed of this because I don't feel like it's something that's dominating my life. I know some people might think, oh, I'm oversharing, but this to me is not oversharing because this is not something that's a huge part of my life. But I would say probably once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks, I'll have a good 5 or 10 minutes where I am just really feeling down. And I'm thinking, I'm never going to be successful. I'm never going to get ahead in life. None of the things that I'm creating in the professional world have any meaning. All of it's a waste and I'm just a loser. And I let those thoughts sit just for a couple of minutes. I don't get upset at them. I just acknowledge. And I think this is really important when we're having negativity. Again, we're not talking about depression right now. We're talking about just that inner negative voice that's the regression to mediocrity, telling you that you're worthless, telling you. And this happens when you have an interaction with someone, with a coworker, with a boss, with a partner. Let those thoughts sit. Let them be there. Don't let them stew, but let them have a place because they need it. They need to be out, to be exposed so that they can be examined. I can have those thoughts and I can let them sit for those 5 minutes or so, and then I can move forward. I don't have to battle them. I don't have to give them a lot of significance in my life. As humans, this is just some weird thing that we all deal with, that we all have these automatic negative thoughts. And we have to let them be and let them go. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about is, I don't know if this is the correct technical term, but I'm going to call it minor depression. I think of minor depression as when you have intense sadness. When you have sadness that maybe lasts several days or even several weeks. This is the kind of thing that you come up against when you do lose your job, when you do break up with someone or are broken up with in a relationship and you're feeling bad about it. Often these are caused by life events, but it can become a pattern because neurons that fire together wire together. And you don't want to dwell. Again, this type of sadness isn't something that just leaves in 5 minutes. But it isn't something that, I don't know how to put this. It's probably good to get therapy when you're going through those types of situations, and it's probably just a short-term thing, maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, meaning 2 or 3 sessions or something like that. But if you let negative behavior patterns in your brain continue, if you focus on them and if you give them credence, then they will grow. So a lot of people, including myself when I was younger, I don't struggle with this anymore, but particularly when I was a teenager, and I think a lot of teenagers struggle with this. And I'm going to go on an aside here, and this may feel a little inappropriate, but these are often the type of people that are talking about committing suicide. People who are saying things like, oh, my life is worthless, I don't want to live anymore. That is typically minor depression, not major depression, if I'm using the technical term minor depression correctly, because major depression I do know a bit about. I went through that, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. So I don't actually think that most of the time minor depression is that dangerous. It sucks. It can we can let it have a really negative impact on relationships with others or in our career, and that can be really frustrating because the sadness comes upon us. We didn't necessarily create it. There's probably something that we did that if we think about it, we can take some ownership for. And I got to be careful with that too, because when we're talking about something like depression, one of the things is, oh, I'm going to blame me, like I'm so bad, I didn't do a good job, so on and so forth. That's not the right kind of taking responsibility that I'm talking about, or taking ownership that I'm talking about. I'm talking about if you look at how you got to a certain place, you can often see that you could have done something differently or taken a different perspective to feel better about it, even if the outcome is bad. So that one I'm going to leave because I don't have a lot of experience with that, and I haven't experienced a long period of sadness in a long time. Well, that's not entirely true. We definitely had some... There's been struggles in marriage, especially right at the beginning in that first year, where there were some long periods of sadness because we were getting adjusted to each other, and it wasn't all just rainbows and butterflies, and there was things that we had to work through. So I would say I might have had some minor depression during then that was really hard to get through. But moving on to major depression. So major depressive disorder is clinical depression. It is not an intense sadness. It is when colors become more gray, music sounds more like noise, things that were enjoyable previously are not enjoyable anymore. Food has less taste. It's very, very difficult to find motivation. And I don't know what caused this for me, but when I was in there were some triggers actually, now that I think about it. But when I was in college, early on, I went through a major depressive episode. And I did take medication, and I am not a person that believes that it is healthy to rely on medication as a long-term solution. I agree with some of the top evolutionary biologists in that it is highly, highly, highly unlikely that in the richest parts of the world, people have genetically evolved to have a huge, disproportionate amount of anxiety and depression as a biological disorder. I believe that it is habits and patterns that most often, not saying all times, of course there are people that have problems with their brain. There are people who are mentally disabled in their learning. There are people who have a mental blindness, meaning that their eyes function, but their brain doesn't actually connect to the function of their eyes. There are all sorts of neurological disorders that do exist and are completely real. What I am suggesting is that most times these are when it's something like anxiety or depression, these are habits that have been formed by the prior aspect that I was talking about, neurons that fire together, wire together, and pathways develop that make it more difficult to get to better brain waves. And that's where medication can really come in and help to give you a jump start to get your brain to activate pathways that weren't being active. You can think of it like being in a rut, right? So if you're driving down a road and there's a rut in the road, if you steer a little to the right or a little to the left, you're likely to get back into the rut. And we create ruts of success and we create ruts of failure in our lives. And sometimes the medication helps you get the boost that helps you get back on the good pathways. And I'm actually, in my particular case, I actually have a really hard time saying that I feel like the medication helped. But I wanted to tell my story. So I just started losing interest in things. It was exactly what I was describing. Everything was bland and gray. There was no feeling. There was no intense sadness. There was nothingness. It was a void. And it grew more and more void-like. And I'm a very much a go-getter type person and very motivated most of the time. And so this was a very different experience for me, and it persisted for months and then on to maybe a year or so. At some point in that, I decided to get help. And it was because I didn't get up one morning. There was a morning that I didn't get out of bed, and I was I told my roommates that I was sick. I texted my buddy that was in one of my classes. I told him that I was sick, and I laid in bed and I didn't get up. And I cried about this. That was actually really good because that was getting a pathway working. Experiencing sadness was a major benefit at that time because it was a feeling. It was not the rut of void. It was more positive to experience sadness. But I don't know if I cried that day or if it was when I went to a therapy session, but that day was the day that I decided, okay, I'm going to go get therapy. And the therapist that I talked to at first, I was going towards inexpensive because I was a college student. And so I got someone who was not very experienced, and the person did not understand what was going on with me because they were expecting, when I was saying that I felt depressed, they were expecting me to be talking about sadness. This psychologist was not actually very well versed in major depressive disorder. And I think I went 1 or 2, maybe 3 times before I finally broke down in front of him and just bawled. And that was excellent to have that release. And he, being more on the inexperienced side, I think this was one of those student clinic type deals where I was getting a steep discount because I was working with someone who was a student of psychology that didn't yet have their degree or much real experience. Anyway, at that point, he handed me off to the real psychiatrist, meaning not just a psychologist, but a psychologist who's interested in the biochemical processes, the one that prescribes medication. And so I started taking medication, and at first, I think a lot of it was just a trick of the mind. I thought that the medication was making me feel funny. In reality, I think it was just a thought process of it that was making me think that, that loop that you get in sometimes. But it gave me hope, and that was the most important thing, is that when I went to get help, and I felt like I was connected with someone who was qualified to give help, I started to get hope. And for me personally, I think that was much more important than the medication. And the medication that I was on was something very slow acting as well. It wasn't a happy pill. It's called Wellbutrin. And it is something that you accumulate over time, and it is supposed to do exactly what I said, help get you out of that rut. It's not generally considered to be habit forming, but it's also not as immediately effective. You don't take it in within a couple of days, feel the high of some of the other medications, but it's much lower risk, which fits my profile because I am very, very scared, especially with issues in my family history and relatives of dependency. So that worked really well for me, but it was really the hope. And it wasn't like I said, it wasn't a process that was over in a couple of days or I started feeling better in a couple of days. It was a persistent hope that the hope helped allow me to allow myself to try more things again and to try to get back into a good rut and good behavior patterns and good thinking patterns. And it probably took somewhere in the realm of 6 months to a year. I think the whole ordeal was in the realm of 18 months, maybe 12 months from the time that I started recognizing that I was not enjoying life and that I had that decline of my quality of life going down, my grades going down, my social connections going down to then getting help, then coming back up out of it. That was somewhere in the realm of 12 months to 18 months, I think. And at the end of it, I wasn't healed. It took years for me to get back to a point where I could say that I felt better. And one of the things that took a long time was for me to trust myself again, because I lost a lot of confidence during that process. I lost a lot of my sense of identity because I became a different person. And that was scary. It was scary to believe that maybe that could happen again. Or I don't think that was my fear as much as that maybe I would never be wholly 100% the person that I was. And I wasn't. I was never wholly 100% the person that I was, because along life's journey took me forward, and it didn't necessarily take me backward. It didn't take me back to who I had been. It got me out of the rut. It got me to a better place, but it took me forward to being a different person. So I'm not the person that I was before I had the major depressive episode, but I'm no worse off, if that makes sense. This would be like a difference between moving left and right as opposed to a difference of moving forward and back. The person that I ended up being was just a different person. So I don't know, really, in sharing that, I don't have a lot of advice for someone who's struggling with depression. It's hard. The best advice that I can have is to accept, or can give, is to always try to accept things, whether they're big or small, negative thoughts, intense sadness, the void, to be able to label it, to be able to recognize and label it, and to accept it. Not to accept it as in to enlarge it or make it grow or to make it part of your being, but to accept it for what it is and to let it be. Not to dwell on it, but to let it. And I find that that is a good pattern in general to help ease out of negative thoughts and sadness. With the void, I think that it is difficult to find hope, but it is necessary to find hope. It is important to hit rock bottom. It is important to have the day that you don't get out of bed and you realize that something must change, that this is not life, and life needs to be more. And I hope that anybody who's going through that you have someone in your circle, whether it's a relative or a church leader, or there's some trusted way to get connected to professional help, someone that you feel okay opening up to reach out to get that help. Because I think that it's critically important. There are times when it's not likely to be able to overcome something alone. And I don't think, again, I've talked about creatures of habit and kind of our biology and our evolutionary nature and little bits and pieces here and there. We are social creatures. So support networks are something that is important as part of our living. So we need to have people in our lives that we can reach out to or be able to find people. And sometimes you have to pay people. Therapy is, in many ways, a paid friend. It's a very different type of friendship, but it's definitely worth it when your options are otherwise limited, or the people that you can turn to don't have the wisdom that can help you, or the wisdom that they have to give isn't helping. Anyway, with all of that, I spent a little bit more time on this than I expected, but that seems to be every day now. I hope that wherever you're at in your life, you have a way to meditate or pray or find a way to accept things as they are, to acknowledge them and to let them be and to let them go, so that you can always be moving forward and that you can exercise your support networks to get help when you need it. With that, I hope that you have, if this is the kind of video that you're looking for help on, maybe this is not going to be your best morning ever, but maybe it can be a morning that helps you get to where you're going to have the best morning ever. And with that, adios.